Started.
We're recording.
Yep.
So you have the option there to continue or to leave the meeting. We're recording it, of course, just to put it up on our website so people who are not able to make it tonight can still view it. Before we start anything, and I'll probably say this again, here's our disclaimer. The League of Women Voters of the United States is a nonpartisan voter education organization encouraging informed, active participation in government. It's the League's position that voting is a fundamental citizen right that must be guaranteed. Brews and Views presentations will not necessarily represent League positions, but the League wants to provide forums for community members and experts who educate us about various topics important to democracy. That's the function of the Brews and Views. So welcome, I'm Teresa Reed, a member of the Brews and Views Committee. We're happy tonight to have Professor Margo Schlanger speaking with us on the recently urgent topic of federal law enforcement deployed in American cities. In several cities, including Washington, D.C., Portland, Oregon, Chicago, Detroit, and more, the Trump administration has sent or threatened to send federal law enforcement agents to confront crowds protesting racism and police violence against people of color and others. Professor Schlanger will discuss what seems to be going on, the legality of the administration's use of federal authorities, and the possibilities for challenges to the deployment generally and some of its tactics more specifically. Professor Schlanger is the Wade H. and Doris M. McCree Collegiate Professor of Law at the University of Michigan, where she joined the faculty in 2009. She's a leading authority on civil rights issues and civil and criminal detention. She teaches constitutional law, torts, and classes relating to civil rights and to conditions of confinement in jails and prisons. She also founded and runs the Civil Rights Litigation Clearinghouse. Professor Schlanger earned her JD from Yale in 1993. She clerked for our favorite, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg from 1993 to 1995, and was subsequently a trial attorney in the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. There, she worked to remedy civil rights abuses by prison and police departments. Schlanger served on the Vera Institute's Blue Ribbon Commission on Safety and Abuse in America's Prisons as an advisor on proposed national standards implementing the Prison Rape Elimination Act and on the American Bar Association's revision of standards on the treatment of prisoners. In 2010, Professor Schlanger was appointed by President Barack Obama as the head of civil rights for the Department of Homeland Security, the agency that seems to have a lead role in many of the administration's troubling federal police efforts. She is the author of dozens of law review and other scholarly articles and is a frequent commentator online and in print on civil rights topics. She's the chief author of a leading casebook, Incarceration and the Law, published in 2020, which you can find at incarcerationlaw.com. Professor Schlanger will deliver some prepared remarks and then take questions from you, many of which have been submitted in advance. If questions arise during the conversation, please put them in the chat function in all caps and we'll get to them, as many as we can. Professor Schlanger, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I was looking down while you were doing that very kind and perhaps too detailed for anybody's patience introduction to try to remember how long you wanted me to speak for before we switch to questions. So if you don't mind just telling me that again, I'll get started.
20-30 minutes if you could speak, and then we'll field questions for the rest of it. I think people probably have a lot to ask.
Great, happy to do it that way. Okay, so around the country, as in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd, as you all know, there have been really very sustained protests in cities all across the country. And those protests have been largely nonviolent, but not entirely nonviolent. And they have provoked a federal law enforcement response. They have provoked, excuse me, a law enforcement response. As the president got madder and madder about how the law enforcement response in some places was fairly restrained, he, on his Twitter feed, was itching to get involved. And so, sure enough, what we've seen across the country, starting in DC, which was actually a little bit different, I'll talk about that in a second, and then spreading to many other cities, most especially Portland, what we've seen is a federal law enforcement taking on a really very noticeable role in what is ordinarily a local policing matter, which is to say responding to protests, being on the scene to try to keep things calm and responding when they are not calm. So the federal piece of that law enforcement task has been both very noticeable and very different in kind than some of the cities. It's been much more aggressive, much more confrontational. Not in all cities, not in Chicago, for example, but in Portland, for example. So that's the prompt for what I've been asked to speak about. And I've been asked to talk about kind of the legal framework in which those responses have taken place, and to get you all some information about what's gone on. So I don't have a big rhetorical point about how terrible it is, although I'll be upfront about my own views, which is that it's terrible. But that's not the main point of this talk. The main point of this talk is just to run through what are the legal parameters and constraints on a federal law enforcement response like that. I'll end with a few words about why it's terrible, but that's not mostly what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so we saw this starting in DC, and DC is different than all the other locations where federal law enforcement has been involved, and that's because all law enforcement in DC is federal, right? DC is a federal enclave. And so I'm going to push that off to one side, and we can talk about that, but I'm going to talk mostly about places that aren't DC. So the basic rule about federal law enforcement is that and people often call these federal troops. They're not troops, right? If by troops you mean military personnel, these aren't troops. These are law enforcement personnel. They're gun carriers. Routinely, they're cops. They have the sort of mission set of cops. They have the command structure of a law enforcement agency, and that's what they are. They're cops. So federal law enforcement needs to be both authorized and constitutional, and it's the authorized part that makes it a little bit different than state law enforcement. So if state law enforcement, state and local law enforcement, right? Like, so here I'm in Washtenaw County, and we have both state and local law enforcement here. We've got, there's the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office, and there's also state troopers who have concurrent jurisdiction over what goes on. Federal law enforcement is a little bit different. Federal law enforcement has to be authorized, for starters. And so if you think about the federal law enforcement agencies, a lot of them are very familiar to you, and you've seen them in spaces where their authorization is really routine. So if you've been to a federal park, you've probably seen federal law enforcement. They have regular police powers in the federal park, right? If you've been to a federal building and you've been through a metal detector on your way into the federal building, you've seen gun carriers at the front of that building, and they look like cops. And guess what? Those are federal law enforcement. What kind of federal law enforcement? It depends. If it's a courthouse, they probably work for the U.S. Marshals Service. If it's anything but a courthouse, they probably work for the Federal Protective Service. The U.S. Marshals Service reports up through the Attorney General. It's part of the Department of Justice. The Federal Protective Service is in the Department of Homeland Security. So if you've been to, if you've ever encountered an FBI agent, you've encountered federal law enforcement. So there's lots and lots of federal law enforcement agencies, dozens really. And in their normal places, they're very unsurprising, very, very normal, right? It's not just chance that has them work there or wherever it is that they're working, or the kind of sound discretion of their command structure. They have statutes. Each one of them has a statute that authorizes them to be usually in some particular specified location, carrying out a specified mission. And so their authorization generally requires both geographic limitations and within the geographic limitations, a particular mission. So for example, FPS, the Federal Protective Service, which is DHS's Federal Property Police Force, operates under 40 US Code 1315, and it says that its priority role is protection of property that is owned or occupied by the federal government and persons on that property. So and then if you look at the statute, the FPS staff, the FPS officers, have various kinds of authorities. They can make arrests without a warrant for an offense against the United States that's committed in their presence. So all of those words matter, right? They can make an arrest without a warrant for an offense against the United States. That means not a state law offense, a federal offense, right? That's committed in their presence. Or they can make an arrest without a warrant if there's a felony cognizable under the laws of the United States, which is a broader group of felonies, if they have reasonable grounds to believe that the person to be arrested is committing or has committed a felony. So I don't mean that you should have memorized that. I just mean that's the kind of language that constrains federal law enforcement. So they have certain authority to do misdemeanor arrests. They have certain authority to do felony arrests. In general, their authority is constrained by that, right? Misdemeanor, felony. It's constrained by this mission, like for example, okay, this has to be for the purpose of protection of persons and property that are owned and occupied by the United States or persons there. And they have a geographic authority. So for FPS, they have broader authority when they're actually on federal property than when they're someplace else. Same thing, for example, for the park police. Park police have certain kinds of authorities. I don't know the park police's authorities off the top of my head, but you could look it up. They have certain kinds of authorities when they're in the parks. But as soon as you get outside of the parks, it's not that they have no authority, but they have much, much less authority. And they have a certain mission to protect people using the parks against crimes committed there. So they don't have general police power, federal law enforcement. So they can't enforce state law, and most criminal law is state law. They can't enforce state law unless it meets certain criteria, which vary by the agency and vary by the statute and vary by the seriousness of the crime and so on. So PS is not the state law enforcement agency authorizing them to enforce state law, or if they, under state law, if they're allowed to enforce state law, which varies by the state. So federally, they're only allowed to enforce state law if they've signed an agreement. As a matter of state law, it just depends on the state. Some states authorize federal law enforcement agents to enforce state law if, for example, the crime is committed in their presence, and others don't. So it just depends. Okay, so that's all of the stuff about authority. And if you heard what I just said, I was talking about two different kinds of ideas. One is the statutory bounds on authority, and the other is the norm-based bounds on authority. So I talked about statutes, and I read you some, kind of complicated language with a lot of clauses that's really hard to hear orally. And all of that is pretty precise and ascertainable, and you can go look it up. And then there's the norm-based bounds, the idea that park police ought to be about parks, and the Federal Protective Service ought to be about federal property, and so on. They ought not be using their jurisdiction as a hook to get at things whose real purpose is something else, right? That's a kind of basic norm-based constraint on federal law enforcement that most of the law enforcement commanders are pretty rigorous about. They don't want their law enforcement agency, even if you can sort of squirrel the mission into their statutory authority, they say, no, that's not really what we do. That's not really what we do. What we're about is, and then they talk about the core of their mission, or at least that's how we like to think that they behave, right? Okay, so that's authority. The second thing that constrains federal law enforcement is the same thing that constrains state and local law enforcement if all is working the way it should, which is to say, the Constitution. So the Constitution imposes limits on when people can be stopped. You have to have reasonable suspicion of crime before you can stop somebody. Now, you can stop them consensually. So you can stop and say, hey, I have a few questions. And you don't have to tell them. You don't have to tell anybody that it has to be consensual. They're supposed to be sturdy enough to just know, which is one of the hugest fictions in American constitutional law, right? That people who aren't lawyers who have studied constitutional law know that when you're, say, on a Greyhound bus and somebody says, yeah, I'd like to look at that bag, that you are entitled to look at them and say, no. But if it's consensual, there are a lot of circumstances in which they can only ask you for a stop or a search if it's consensual, but they don't have to tell you that they're relying on your consent. They just have to ask you, and then okay. But if it's not consensual, they need reasonable suspicion. Arrests need probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed, probable cause to believe that you're involved enough to justify arrest, and force has to be reasonable. All of that is under the Fourth Amendment, which requires that searches and seizures be reasonable. That's the basic source of constitutional law for all of this. And there's a very much elaborated, kind of long, extensive set of constitutional tests of all of this, which tend to be decided in favor of the government, but not always. So, if the government wants to search something that's in a car, just for example, they're usually going to be able to search it. Not absolutely always, but they're usually going to be able to search it. Just that's like the realpolitik of Fourth Amendment law. But there is this set of constraints. In addition to the Fourth Amendment set of constraints, there are equal protection constraints and First Amendment constraints. So the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment doesn't actually apply to the federal government. The 14th Amendment talks about state action, and it's not about the federal government. But I misspoke because I talked about the Fourth Amendment. Well, it doesn't matter. So the Equal Protection Clause doesn't apply directly to the federal government, but the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause has been held by the courts to kind of incorporate the idea of equal protection. And so all of the same norms that are supposed to apply to states, which say no intentional racist decision, no intentionally discriminatory decision-making, no intentionally discriminatory action, all of that stuff applies to federal law enforcement by way of the Fifth Amendment Due Process Clause. So I'll just for shorthand call that equal protection. And so they're not allowed to do things that are discriminatory. That's not a Fourth Amendment right. That's a Fifth Amendment or an equal protection right. In addition, the First Amendment, which says that Congress shall make no laws abridging the freedom of speech, also applies to federal law enforcement, which means that they cannot retaliate against people for speech activity. Okay, there are other clauses, of course, but that cluster of Bill of Rights protections is the essential ones. And so so what's been going on recently has been challenged on all of those fronts. Number one, it's been attacked as unauthorized under the statute. It's hard. That's a hard attack. Generally speaking, the federal agencies have hooked their presence in these protests to federal property in such a way that they can probably I mean, I'd want to know more facts, but it's not implausible that they can kind of hook that to the FPS statute. And I should have said, each of these agencies has its own rules, but they can, under certain circumstances, cross-deputize. So if you work for the Bureau of Prisons, you can be authorized to exercise FPS authorities. Now, cross-deputization is dangerous because it means you haven't been trained. I mean, if you work for the Bureau of Prisons, you don't know anything about controlling crowds. I mean, right? People who work in prisons, you might know something about quelling prison riots. You might not, but you might know something about weaponless, because prison guards are usually, at least they don't have guns, and there's a lot of weaponry they don't have access to. You might know something about weaponless takedowns, but you don't know a lot about, you know, smoke grenades and so on, because you don't use them. And you probably don't know anything about the First Amendment rights, because no one's trained you on that, because that's not something that comes up, or at least it's not thought to come up in prison much. So there is cross-deputization that takes care of the authority problem, but it leaves people rather under-trained. Okay. One of the things that was going on in Portland is that a special kind of like a SWAT team from CBP, Customs and Border Protection. CBP SWAT team, which is really highly trained to deal with very aggressive, very high-end drug smuggling. That's really what they do. They were brought in to deal with crowds. And guess what? It turns out they're not very good at dealing with crowds because they don't have any training, and because they're very used to thinking of the people they encounter as very, very dangerous, because the people they encounter are quite dangerous, right? And so the mindset is wrong, the command structure is wrong, the training is wrong. But that doesn't mean they're not authorized, because they can sign cross-deputization agreements with FPS and kind of glom onto FPS's authority. Okay, so the first attack that we've seen in recent weeks on all this federal law enforcement is, hey, it's unauthorized. Second attack, hey, it's being done really poorly in a way that betrays the lack of training, the poor command structure, the fact that it's outside of the norms of federal law enforcement. It's not at all a good idea, not only because it's racist and retaliatory and excessive, although that's the third attack, it's racist and retaliatory and excessive, not only because of that, but also just because, like, there's a mismatch of mission and actors. So that's been another attack. And then there's it's racist, retaliatory, and excessive, right? And that's been a third attack. So let me just think if there's more that I really want to say in preface. I guess the final thing that I want to say in preface is this. There's been, I don't think it's coincidental that the recent interventions by federal law enforcement have been especially heavily by DHS law enforcement, Department of Homeland Security law enforcement. I don't think it's a coincidence that it's been HSI, Homeland Security Investigation, which is a sort of a police force that doesn't do deportation, that works for ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that it's been HSI and CBP, Customs and Border Protection, and FPS, the Federal Protective Service. I don't think it's a coincidence that it's been those organizations that have had really lead roles. And we've heard a lot less about, you know, FBI and Marshal Service and so on. And that is because I think, I don't have solid evidence about this, but I think that there's been, that the DOJ law enforcement agencies have a much longer standing kind of tradition and a certain sturdiness about their mission that resists being deployed to suit the fancy of an aggressive infantile president. And so I suspect that DOJ has pushed back a little bit, because honestly, when you're talking about courthouses, which is what we were talking about in Portland, the natural law enforcement agency to take the lead would have been the Marshal Service. it's a little weird that FPS had that. FPS doesn't normally, they have authority to do it, but they don't normally show up in courthouses. And so why is it that it's been FPS and CBP and HSI? Why are they playing the lead? And I think the answer is that they're younger, that their missions are less defined, less bred in the bone of their agents, and that their leadership is not Senate confirmed and not sturdy enough to push back in the way that one would expect that senior leaders in the executive branch would push back when asked to do something that violates the norms of their agency. And that, by the way, has led to what I'm convinced has been widespread unconstitutional policing. So DHS hasn't had a Senate confirmed leader since like practically time out of mind. Like you can't even remember the last time there was a Senate confirmed leader anywhere in sight in DHS. They don't have Senate confirmed secretary. They don't have a Senate confirmed deputy secretary. They don't have it's like the police is full of folks who couldn't possibly get through Congress and who know they couldn't get through Congress and who therefore feel very little compunction about the yelling and screaming that Congress is going to do with them when they violate their mission. As a result, one of the things that we've seen recently is this kind of interesting effort by the prior leaders of DHS to say, oh my God, you're destroying my agency. So we've seen all of the prior secretaries of DHS, the Senate confirmed ones from prior administrations, saying, oh my God, you're destroying my agency. Now, your mileage may vary on how you feel about DHS as an agency, but that is an unusual moment when Republicans and Democrats unite and say, oh my God, you're destroying my agency. And it's so why are they upset about it? They're upset about it because there's a divorce of mission and task. And they're upset about it because it's destroying what they think of as the legitimacy of DHS in the minds of the American public and rendering it susceptible to a massive reorganization / defunding / disappearance if Senator Biden, if Vice President Biden, so he's been senator for so long, and so, but if Vice President Biden wins the presidency, and they like DHS and they want it to stick around, and they are worried that it's rather what's the right word, spineless participation in the domestic adventures of the Trump administration render it susceptible to being defunded. And so they've come in and said, oh my God, you're destroying my agency. This was a bad idea. DHS isn't supposed to be about the crowd police against American citizens. That's not what it's for. And don't do that. And so what you'll notice is that that particular group is complaining about is this divorce, again, of mission and task, as opposed to what you're hearing from the farther left, which is complaining about discrimination, retaliation, and excessive force, right? So the nature of those two complaints is pretty different, but it fits pretty well in what I was talking about as the sort of two-pronged constraints on federal law enforcement. One, it has to be authorized. Two, it has to be constitutional. Okay, so I think that was 20 minutes, 20-ish minutes. So let me stop and take questions.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. Now my head is kind of swimming. I have a whole bunch of questions, but I hope I can make them make sense in the context of what you've just said, because I've just learned so much. So if some of these questions seem like I wasn't listening, I actually was, but I haven't processed it all. Okay.
Not to worry.
Okay. So, so first of all, I just want to say that currently, obviously the big flashpoints in law enforcement are local law enforcement, the police and police unions and that level of, police brutality at the local level. But of course, you're here to talk about the federal agencies. And I think I'm really interested in what you just said about the fact that most of the egregious actions are being taken out of DHS. And the reason for that is because it's a less mature institution. That's really interesting to me.
I mean, to be clear, I'm guessing, right? It's not like I was at the meetings. Maybe Bill Barr has said yes every time anybody's asked him to do anything. but I'm just guessing.
Well, obviously, this is a point of great concern, right? Because we've seen that Attorney General Barr is not really the Attorney General for the United States. He's the president's personal attorney at this point. And so I guess one of my questions is about, and it's actually several of my questions are about the bulwark between these agencies and citizen safety. You know, what the GAO recently found that both the acting director and the acting deputy director of DHS are illegally in their positions.
The secretary and the deputy secretary, right.
There you go, the secretary and the deputy secretary. So and I'm sure many people on the call are concerned about what are the constraints on their actions?
Yeah, so, I mean, the GAO's theory on the secretary of DHS or the acting secretary and the deputy secretary and so on was based on a fairly technical violation of the rules governing successions on resignation of Senate confirmed folks.
Right.
So the idea was that when Kevin McAleenan was the acting secretary, and McAleenan had been confirmed, if I'm remembering correctly, had been confirmed as deputy secretary. When he was the acting secretary, and then he resigned, he named the wrong person to succeed him. He set up, I may have this wrong. It may be that it was Elaine Duke who did this wrong, but whatever. The point is that that when there was somebody in office who actually had been Senate confirmed, they set up an order of succession that was not the right order of succession. And they if I remember correctly, Elaine Duke, who was confirmed as the undersecretary, she set up an order. First she resigned, and then she by tweet said, no. When I said I resigned today, what I meant was I resigned in 3 days. And then in that 3 days, she did some stuff that she could have only done as secretary. And I believe that what GAO, I'd have to go look at it again because I only read the news reports. I didn't actually read the report. But I think that what GAO said was, well, look, you don't get to resign and then say, oh, take backsies. Like, you don't get to do that. And so some of the stuff that you did in that 3 days that only the secretary could do, like, no one's ever done it. And what that means is that the succession is wrong. And so, et cetera. So I want to be clear that the illegally in their position argument is a fairly technical argument, you know, that the order of succession was never appropriately promulgated, and therefore it doesn't apply. Okay. So I don't think that's the issue about non-accountability. I really don't. I think the issue is that they're not Senate confirmed. I don't think it has to do with this technical violation of the order of succession. Like it's better when people know what the hell they're doing and when they like have lawyers who actually do what lawyers do, which is make sure that you cross T's and dot I's. Lawyers do other things too, but boy, they do that. And somebody wasn't being very careful. And so they should have done that. It's an embarrassment. That said, I don't think that's the reason why DHS is so malleable right now. I think what's going on is that, you know, they don't have anybody Senate confirmed, and they don't have anybody who's even Senate confirmable. And
right.
And so they've got only people who their only allegiance is owed to the president.
Right.
And that's a bad situation. Now, is it you know, unique? No, you started off this question by saying that you thought that that was the same thing for Bill Barr, that he's too answerable to the president and not enough to the American people, and he's
right.
Senate confirmed. So it's not a unique situation, but it is a problem. Is that what's been going on? Maybe. I mean, maybe also DHS's authorities are a little too broad, a little too sloppily written. You know, those authorities were all like, boy, was there a hustle to get that agency stood up after 9/11. And maybe nobody thought, well, what happens if we have a toddler in the White House?
Yeah, right. So my question is, if they are, their status at the agencies is certainly legally tenuous.
Oh, yeah, you wanted to know. So what can be done to constrain them? So,
Yes.
yeah, so I don't think anything, I don't think that's about their status, but what can be done to constrain them? It's really hard. I
Yeah.
mean, and it's mostly political. But the political doesn't mean nothing. I mean, just look at what's gone on with the post office recently, right?
Yeah.
So there was the post office doing what I gather from reading in the newspapers, like, tearing up post boxes and junking expensive sorting equipment, and the outrage
Yeah.
in the press and the outrage in the polity constrained it. Well, that's actually a really important, like, that's something that constrains it. And I don't think it's a coincidence that DHS left Portland,
Yeah.
right? Like, that's what they did. They left Portland. And in the meantime, there's obviously also the courts, but courts aren't great norm enforcers. Courts tend to enforce things that are less slippery than norms. And a big part of what's gone wrong here is the norms violations. And so you shouldn't really expect that courts will do anything about that particular kind of violation.
They're also slow.
Well,
So,
they can be slow.
yeah.
The courts in this administration have actually been pretty quick. I mean, to be honest. But I mean, the courts enjoined the use of tear gas in Portland by local police in a matter of days.
Yeah, that's great. Then we've got the Don McGahn situation. So
Yeah, it's complicated.
So
But
sometimes,
courts can be pretty quick.
yeah,
It depends if you have a judge who wants to be fast.
yeah. So it's interesting, your framing of the issue in terms of an immature agency like DHS, which is 10, how old is it? 20 years old?
Oh,
The calendar, see what
17 years old.
it's less than 20 years old. So versus the DOJ. So I wanted to ask you about the 18.
I mean, let's just be clear. It's not like DOJ has been so awesome in all of this.
No, I know.
Right? But yeah.
I know, it's scary. It's really scary because I think it was I had read that it was Bureau of Prison officers in Lafayette Square.
Mm-hmm.
And unmarked. So I believe that the finding was that those were BOP,
Mm-hmm.
which is of course under the DOJ, which is just very, very frightening, especially when they're unmarked. So I wanted to ask you about the Insurrection Act of 1807 and the Posse Comitatus Act and their relevance to this discussion.
Yeah, so those have to do with military authorities, and these are not military authorities. These are law enforcement.
Okay, so if Trump wanted to bring the military in, that's when the Insurrection Act and the Posse Comitatus Act would come into play, but they have no relevance at this point.
Correct.
Okay, that's kind of good. So Trump, he has said that he's sending in federal troops for a variety of reasons. He has said they're to protect specific federal properties.
Right, but he hasn't talked about federal troops. He's talked about federal cops. I want to just keep emphasizing that, right? These are not troops. These are cops.
Okay, all right.
Right now, maybe you think there's no difference, and maybe there is no difference, but the authorities are different. The command structure is different. Those statutes that you talked about apply to one and not the other. Like legally, they're pretty different.
That's super important. Can you clarify the difference for us?
Troops are military,
Cops,
and these are
like
cops.
police officers versus troops.
Yeah.
Okay.
Correct.
So it comes from, it's the difference is in the authorizing.
Yeah. So I mean, the military operates. I mean, just for example, when a member of the military commits a crime, they're tried by their own courts.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just a for example, but military has a huge range of different authorities, different structures, different, as I said, different command structures, different mission, different constraints, and you can talk about these as federal troops in a kind of rhetorical way, but if you're trying to understand the legal constraints on them, you're gonna muddle yourself if you call them troops. They're not troops, they're cops.
That's really great. It's really, it's really good to know. Should we take some comfort in that distinction?
I don't know. I mean, honestly, Posse Comitatus talks about how you can't use military in the United States against the United States population, except in certain very, very limited circumstances.
Right.
And so that would be an extra constraint. But we know that doesn't apply to federal cops because, as I said, we've all been to federal buildings and to federal parks and so on. And guess what? There they are, right there with their guns.
Right.
Right? Those are gun carriers, which is what, you know, those are gun carriers who have arrest authorities for us if we are in their jurisdiction, in their mission. So
Yeah.
I don't know if we should take comfort from it or not, but it is just, you know, like you won't understand what's going on if you don't kind of keep the division in your head.
Yeah, that's really good to know. So, of course, there was a great deal of controversy while the Homeland Security bill was being argued about in terms of civil rights issues. And
You mean in 2003?
yeah, well,
I think there was almost no controversy. That thing went
really?
through so fast you could hardly, like, nobody even had time to read it.
Maybe I just read The Nation.
I mean, you know, like we created the biggest we created an enormous federal agency in a matter of weeks.
Yeah.
I mean, no, I mean, you know, maybe somebody considers that controversial, but I don't know how many votes there were against it. I'll bet it was under 10%.
Yeah. Yeah. Is that a problem?
No, I mean, you know, DHS is a problematic agency in a variety of ways. It doesn't have to be. I mean, you know, the main question that governs DHS is the policy, right? So if you hate DHS because you think people shouldn't get deported, what you hate is deportation. That's not about DHS. That's about the fact that we have deportations. If you think that, you know, there's a problem with the way, I guess what I'm trying to say is this. Many of the issues that people have with DHS have to do with the laws that it's enforcing. Now, not all of it. DHS could run detention, for example, in a very different way than it does, in a way that seeks to minimize the infringement of liberty that is inherent in detention, and remembers more stringently that that immigration violations are civil violations, and that the response to them does not, even if there's going to be a response, a deportation response, that doesn't have to involve an incarcerative response while the rest of it is getting ginned up. And DHS could do an awful lot better on that front. So I don't mean that everything that goes on is just like, look, those are the laws, but some of it is. And so is that a problem with DHS, or is that a problem that we really should have a path to citizenship for the, you know, 7 or 8 million people who have made their lives here for so many years, and they shouldn't be under threat of deportation? Like, you know, count me on the side of path to citizenship.
Mm-hmm. Does it make sense to hate and fear DHS, aspects of DHS, some of the law enforcement aspects of DHS, because the authority to deploy them is vague?
I think that probably there are some things that could be done to tighten up DHS's authorities, to constrain FPS more, to constrain HSI more, to probably also to constrain Border Patrol more. Those are the 3 main ones. Mm-hmm. So I think those would be good changes on all 3 of those. I think that would be a smart set of moves to make in federal statutes.
Okay, so right now, I mean, people are terrified that President Trump will send, as he has threatened, will send federal cops. I caught myself. Will send federal cops into cities to quell real or ginned up violence.
Yeah, I mean, it's outrageous and appalling, just to be clear. You know, just because you have authority to do something doesn't mean that you should do it, right? Isn't that something that every parent knows? I mean, think of all the things you could do to your kids that you have authority to do. You could ground them for 2 years every time they screw up. But like, it's not a good idea, right? You could do it. You have the authority to do it, but it's bad parenting. Well, DHS may have the authority to do what's going on, but it's bad policing. It's not a coincidence that things calmed down in Portland after they withdrew.
After they left, right? It backfires. If you really go to the max, it backfires.
It's terrible policing strategy.
Uh-huh. Okay, but there's nobody, why don't authorities at the agency, the relevant agency, say, no, we're not going to do that?
Yeah, well, they don't really have the authority to say no to the president.
Okay.
I mean, they can say, hey, it's illegal, but he's the chief law enforcement officer of the United States.
Uh-huh.
If it's illegal and he tells them to do it, I mean, they can push back in various ways. And if they were a little sturdier, they might be able to push back in various ways. But honestly, like this is on the president. This is not DHS, the rogue agency. That's not what we're watching. We're watching DHS, the immature agency, say yes to the president. It's on him.
That's really interesting, but it's also really frightening, because then what are the constraints on him? Besides public outrage, besides the fact that it can backfire, but that's cold comfort.
Yeah.
If your kid is shot in the head with a rubber bullet and needs reconstructive surgery. So
so the constraints are the defined authorities, the Constitution, and the public outcry. Those are the constraints.
What was the first one?
The defined authorities.
Okay.
Right? The Constitution and outcry. Like those are the constraints. And to the extent we feel like those are not enough constraints, maybe the answer is to elect people with better judgment.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But how do you feel that those constraints worked in Portland? I mean, it seems like the first two did not work. It was only the public outcry that.
Well, I don't know. I think that there was the beginnings of some, all right, let me say this differently. I don't think it was a coincidence that federal law enforcement stuck to a pretty tight perimeter around the courthouse. Not as tight as it should have been, but a pretty tight perimeter. That's the defined authorities, right?
Yeah.
The constitutional stuff, medium, and then the public outcry. I mean, that's what we've got. We don't have a system where there's a super authority who gets to tell other people with authority, hey, cut it out. We have a dialogic system between courts and politicians and career government officials and the public, and they all kind of talk to each other and jostle against each other, and we hope that we land someplace not too terrible.
Yeah, I'm learning so much. Thank you. I have a question about a nightmare scenario that I've read about here and there. But my first question is the National Guard, are these troops or are these cops?
No, troops.
The National Guard is troops. Okay.
That's military.
So there are almost 350,000 Army National Guard and 100,000 or so Air National Guard, who are typically, I have this right. My understanding is that they're typically controlled by the states, but that the president can federalize them. Okay. So the nightmare scenario that I read in somewhat hysterical tweets and so forth is that Trump might call on the National Guard to stop ballot counting. Like election night is passed. He says he's won. All of these, 60% of the votes are cast by mail. 30% of them have been counted. He says election's over and calls in the National Guard to stop the counting.
Right.
Is that
lose sleep. But that would be illegal, but that, do we have a set of institutions capable of fighting back? I hope so, if that happens.
Well, governors say, no, not on my watch?
I don't know the answer to that. I think so, but really, I'm pretty good on federal law enforcement, but now you're talking military, and
Yeah, okay.
I don't know all of the ways that, that I just don't know.
Yeah, okay. People are, I mean, there was a time when all of these worries would seem completely fantastic, but sadly,
Oh no, I know. I think, like, I hope and trust that people who do know more about that than I do are sitting there thinking about that they're gaming out what happens when. But I'm not in those game. I'm not in those game
right,
strategy sessions.
right. I have at least one more question. I think it's two, maybe. And then there may be some in the chat, which Shelley, I hope you'll pull up for me. So this sounds naive because I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. People were alarmed that the federal agents, officers who are deployed weren't marked in any way. No name, no authority. Apparently that it's not in the statute that they have to be.
It's not illegal, but boy, is it terrible when you can't figure. I mean, so there are reasons why sometimes you don't want to have names. Fear of various kinds of threats that can be used against law enforcement. And sometimes those fears are reasonable, and other times they're very much overblown. But there is no reason whatsoever not to be able to tell what agency a particular person works for, so that you can figure out who they're accountable to, and figure out if they're operating under appropriate authorities and with appropriate training. And you can't do that if you don't know who they are. So you don't have to know that it's John Smith, but boy, you really ought to know that it's FPS.
Yeah.
And in many, many circumstances, it's not a coincidence that it is a general practice in law enforcement. And let's just be clear, like, in general, law enforcement deals with people who don't like them.
Yeah.
Right? Like if what you do for a living is go around arresting people, then you encounter a lot of people who don't think you're the greatest thing since sliced bread. And nonetheless, when you look, like people wear badges with their names on them.
Right.
And so like honestly, oftentimes the answer to somebody saying, oh, but what if somebody finds out who I am and they're mean to me? The answer is suck it up.
Right.
But but there are sometimes reasons why you don't want, a person's name to be immediately obvious. There is, as far as I'm concerned, never a reason why it shouldn't be obvious what agency a person works for.
So whether the name is visible or not, that's kind of a balancing of rights and, and risks and so forth. But so would it take a change to this authorizing statutes to require a badge number and identification of the agency?
Certainly, it could certainly be done by statute. It could actually be done by reg too. It wouldn't have to be done by statute. If an administration wanted to do it, they could do it in a regulation. But if the people wanted to do that, they could put it, you could put in a statute something that says, absent some compelling, you always want to allow for something you haven't thought of. So absent some compelling exigencies, blah, 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 like some words, all activities of officers of this named force shall be done with equipment that clearly identifies the agency. You could easily do that, or that clearly identifies the agent and the agency with appropriate measures taken for agent safety.
Yeah.
It would be easy to do that by statute.
And it's terrifying, especially because we've had encouragement of right-wing militias in the last 3.5, 4 years. It's terrifying that unmarked, people just wearing a costume that says police can sweep people off the street.
Yeah, it is. It is terrifying. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting is that in some big city police forces, the internal affairs unit investigates both abuses of power by actual cops and pretend cops.
Right.
And they do both so that they have kind of jurisdiction before they know, was this a person pretending to be a cop who, you know, kidnapped and raped you, or was this an actual cop who kidnapped and raped you? And they don't have to figure out the answer to that before they can investigate, because they have jurisdiction over both.
Yeah, right.
Teresa,
Right.
Teresa, there were some good questions in the chat here. I don't know if you want to take a look at them, or do you want me to
Would
ask?
you? No, if you'd read them, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay. The first question, actually, there's a couple of questions that interested me. One is that let me just read it. Having done human rights activism in Zimbabwe and Amnesty International for almost 20 years, one concern that I have in light of this topic is the politicization of the military and federal security forces. I mean, we've already been talking about the federal security forces, but maybe you've already answered this.
No, I think that this is a good point. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the cities where Trump has deployed or threatened to deploy federal forces have been Democratic cities. Now, to be clear, cities are where Democrats live, right? So once you're talking about an urban center, you're often, I think mostly, and I don't know how most is the mostly, but you know, most big city mayors are Democrats. Not all, but most big city mayors are Democrats. And so in some ways, I don't mean to overstate this, but I don't think it's a coincidence that that these conversations have been, that the threats have been to go into places where the concentration of people of color and Democrats is very high. And that way, if you alienate all the people who live there, it doesn't matter because they're not your voters anyway. And so what you can do is put on a show for people who are not in harm's way on the television screens. And so there's no political cost because you don't care about those votes. So I think that's awful and not coincidental. But I do think we should notice that, you know, most cities are Democratic when we notice this.
Another question was simply, from the point of view of someone that is participating in a mass protest, what is behavior that is considered legal, freedom of expression, and what is behavior that is considered illegal that can lead to their arrest by these, you know, by the federal cops?
Yeah, so in general, if you don't yourself harm a person, harm property, threaten to harm a person, threaten to harm property, and if you obey the lawful orders of police, then you're good. Now, there's a lot buried in that obey the lawful orders. How do you know that the orders are lawful, right? You wanna be sure, like you just obey the orders and you kind of litigate later if those orders were unlawful. The thing that's been happening, not just with federal law enforcement, but often with state law enforcement and local law enforcement, is that cops, this happened a lot in St. Louis in our last go round through a range of protests after Ferguson. Cops will give an order that cannot be obeyed and then use force and arrest authority to try to hook it to the fact that you didn't obey the order. So for example, you'll get an order to disperse in an area that's too tightly constrained. This is a little bit less now because of COVID, but in an area that's too tightly populated to disperse fast enough to obey the order, right? And so you can't obey the order, and then there you are getting tear gassed and arrested. So in some, and is that legal? No, it's not legal, but you're definitely in harm's way. So, but the answer is, you know, if you don't harm or threaten persons or property, and if you obey law enforcement orders, then you ought to be fine. But there's a lot of work being done by that ought to be.
Okay. One other thing, this was, somebody asked, somebody said there was a news article that there is a total of 800,000 of these federal law enforcement officers. Is that number is that?
Yeah, that seems plausible. I mean, it's all of ICE. Well, it's not all of ICE, but it's all of the and you know, it's a big chunk of ICE, a big chunk of CBP, the FBI. You know, there's a lot of, yeah. I mean, I don't know that number, but and I would have thought it was a little smaller than that, but
Yeah. Okay.
but that doesn't seem crazy.
Okay. And one, if I can do just one last one, somebody asked at the very outset, how, if this is kind of a historical question of interest to me, is that how are these interventions different legally compared to what President Johnson did to integrate the Southern?
Oh, wait. You know what? 800,000 is state and local and federal. That makes much more sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's 100,000 federal, 700,000 state and local.
Okay.
Okay.
State and local police, like,
Yeah.
okay, yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
state and local.
All right.
So yeah,
Oh,
so
great.
I'm glad, because it did seem high, but
That's
and I'm
good.
embarrassed that I couldn't say, oh no, that's 8 times too high. So
Oh,
you know,
goodness.
forgive me, all of you, but yeah.
Okay.
So okay, back to the question about
Okay,
Johnson.
so this is a historical question of interest. How are these interventions different legally compared to what President Johnson did to integrate the Southern schools?
So when in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 10 years after Brown versus Board of Ed, right? Brown versus Board of Ed, the first decision was 1954. And for 10 years, what we saw was massive resistance. Finally, in 1964, with the Civil Rights Act, the federal government got fully on board with the idea that it was time to desegregate. And it did that through a variety of interventions. One of the major interventions, which was not the one that this question talks about, was that it threatened to withhold federal money from any school department, from any from any school district that didn't sign on to a plan that the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights, well, it wasn't the Department of Education, it was HEW, but that HEW's Office of Civil Rights approved of, right? And that was an enormous step that happened in the aftermath of the 64 Act, authorized by Title VI of the 64 Act. Okay, so a lot of what got done was not done by the very dramatic federalization of troops. But in addition, there were a variety of federal court orders that said it's time to desegregate. Now, it had taken them a long time to get there. It's 10 years after Brown, and we're actually talking about a couple years more. So it had taken them a long time, but finally they said, we're done with all deliberate speed, which was the sort of oxymoron of 55 order in Brown versus Board of Ed in 1955 from the Supreme Court. We're done with, you know, all deliberate speed, which is sort of the, you know, blue redness. It's time to desegregate now. And when states continued with massive resistance, there was this federal court order that needed to be enforced. And so the federal government was able to say, you know, correctly, there's a federal court order that needs to be enforced, and you don't get to go against that federal court order, and we can use federal authority to insist that you follow it. So the work being done there was that the states took state reserves, right? Like picture FOBUS and so on. The state took state military and said, we will stand against the desegregation of this school, at which point Johnson federalizes the military and says, stand down. So the military functions in part as protector of, you know, some of the desegregating kids, but in part, what's mostly happening is just a stand down order. So it's the combination of those two, but it's quite different in terms of the sort of authority, in terms of the affected personnel, and in terms of the kind of the justification that was offered.
I think I'm just a little confused about that. You said that what Johnson did was he federalized the state militaries. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, it's the state, it's the reserves. And in general, a state has some authority over those reserves, but they are federal military at the behest of the president.
I get it. Okay. All right. Clear. Okay. Teresa? I mean,
I just have one question left, I think. And that is that I have read about, again, maybe these are fever dreams about, and maybe it's just a lack of understanding of what you've explained to us, but that it would have to be DHS, that the Homeland Security Act provides powers to the president that, and maybe it's other aspect, maybe it's other federal statute as well, that are unknown to the public.
I mean, you know, the public doesn't know very much about authorities, right?
Yeah, right.
I mean, so I mean, you know, like, tell me about the FBI's authorities. Like, you know, the FBI is like an old and storied police force, right? It's in how many television shows are all about the FBI, right? Like there's a whole genre of romance novel that's about the FBI, and yet nobody has any idea what their actual authorities are. So yeah. I don't think that's unique to DHS. I don't think anybody knows what any federal agency's authorities are. But yes, it's true. Nobody has the faintest idea what you know, DHS's authorities are. Nobody even knows what any of the acronyms mean.
Yeah, right.
Right? And like which part of it is ICE and which part of it is CBP, and what's that whole thing about CBP has to be within 100 miles of the border, and isn't everything within 100 miles of the border, and is that a free zone? And like, you know, like the level of ignorance isn't quite the right word. It's just like nobody, you know, that's like when we live in peaceful, responsible times, people don't have to know that stuff.
Exactly. And the fact is that it sounds like there is enough immaturity in the agencies and leeway in the law, so that given the kind of president we have right now, there's reason for alarm.
Yes, I mean, I think that's right, but I don't want to undersell that. I think that a good deal of what's been going on is also unconstitutional.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not, you know, some of it is retaliatory and some of it is discriminatory and some of it is excessive, and each of those is illegal: retaliatory, discriminatory, excessive. The Constitution forbids all three.
We live in interesting times. Shelley, are there other questions?
I think we've pretty much covered it.
I see we've lost a bunch of folks too.
Sorry, what, Margo?
Yeah, we did lose a few, but I think it was a pretty interesting. You covered a lot of ground. So I guess we can maybe close things down now.
Sure.
Okay, so thank you everybody who stayed and listened to Margo. It was just really, really interesting.
Thanks
really
for having me.
I just want to let everybody know that because of the serious threats to the integrity of November's vote, which are emerging very quickly, Brews Views committee is considering increasing the frequency of events throughout this election period, and possibly to the end of 2020. Among the topics we may cover and possible dates are September 2nd, the status of the USPS. September 16th, voters' rights. What are your rights as a voter? September 30th, pre-election checkup on issues like the USPS service, absentee voting, COVID-19, and so forth. October 21st, U of M professor of law Len Niehoff will speak on protections for the First Amendment. November 4th, we're hoping to have a post-election day discussion of emergent issues. It's expected that we won't know the results of the elections for some time after, so that will be very interesting. November 18th, we will have post-election status report on the ongoing and new issues, lawsuits, and so forth. So anyway, we will keep you informed of these topics as they develop. And if you have requests or suggestions for topics or speakers, please contact us. You can use our website, which is lwvannarbor.org, and fill out a contact form. And our email is league@lwvannarbor.org. So thank you very much. Thank you, Margo, and thank you in particular to our tech team, Susan Woolley, Linda Williams, and Nancy Brooken. And don't forget to patronize our Holmes Brewery and Pointless Brewery.
Yeah, definitely. And a reminder that the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization, and that the views expressed tonight are those of our guest and anybody else
I
who
called
has
the president
spoken.
a toddler.
Sorry?
I said, I'm sorry I called the president a toddler.
Well, it's a very challenging time. So thank you, Margo. We really appreciate it. Everybody be well.
Yeah.